July 17th, 1979. A body floats to the surface of a creek in Staten Island. The police pull it out. They notice immediately that something's wrong. The hands are missing, cut off at the wrists. The message is clear. This man brought someone into the family who shouldn't have been there. His name is Dominic Napolitano. They called him Sonny Black. He was a captain in the Bonanno crime family, and 6 weeks ago, he found out that his close associate, a guy he'd vouched for, a guy he'd brought to meetings, a guy he trusted, was an FBI agent. Sonny Black knew what was coming. He knew the rules. When you vouch for someone and they turn out to be a rat, you pay the price. He handed over his jewelry to his girlfriend. He told his crew to take care of his affairs. Then he went to the meeting where he knew they'd kill him. That's story number 3. But first, let's talk about 2 other times the mob learned that trust is the most expensive mistake you can make. Story 1. Anthony Casso. Anthony Casso became underboss of the Lucchese crime family in 1986. He was smart, he was ruthless, and he had something no other mobster had: 2 NYPD detectives on his payroll. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were decorated New York City police detectives. They'd both received multiple commendations. They'd both built reputations as excellent investigators. And they were both working for Anthony Casso. Casso paid him $75,000 per month. In exchange, they provided him with confidential police information. They told him when investigations were targeting him. They told him who was cooperating with authorities. They even told him where witnesses were being held. And occasionally, they killed people for him. In 1986, Casso wanted a Gambino family associate named Jimmy Hidell dead. Hidell had been involved in a botched hit on Casso earlier that year, a shooting that left Casso wounded but alive. Casso wanted revenge. He asked his detectives to handle it. On September 23, 1986, Eppolito and Caracappa pulled Jimmy Hidell over in Brooklyn. They were in an unmarked police car. They flashed their badges. Hidell got in the car willingly. He thought he was being arrested. They drove him to a garage where Anthony Casso was waiting. Casso tortured Hidell for hours, trying to get information about who had ordered the hit. Then he killed him. Hidell's body was never found. For years, Eppolito and Caracappa continued working for Casso. They provided information, they helped dispose of bodies, they were involved in at least 8 murders between 1986 and 1990. The arrangement was perfect. Casso had inside information on every investigation targeting him. He knew which phones were tapped, he knew which locations were under surveillance, he knew which associates were cooperating. He was untouchable, until he wasn't. In 1990, the FBI arrested Casso's boss, Vittorio Amuso, on racketeering charges. Casso became acting boss of the Lucchese family. But the attention was too much. Every law enforcement agency in New York was watching him. In September of 1990, Casso went into hiding. He lived in various apartments across New Jersey, moving every few weeks, staying off the streets. He stayed hidden for 2.5 years. But in January of 1993, the FBI finally caught him. They arrested him at a girlfriend's house in New Jersey. The charges included racketeering, murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Casso faced life in prison, possibly the death penalty. So he made a decision that shocked everyone. He agreed to cooperate. In 1994, Anthony Casso became a government informant. He admitted to participating in 36 murders. He provided information about the Lucchese family structure and operations, and he told the FBI about his 2 detectives. The FBI investigated Eppolito and Caracappa. It took them years to build a case. The murders had happened a decade earlier, and most of the evidence was circumstantial. but in 2005, they finally arrested both detectives. The trial was in 2006. The prosecution presented testimony from Casso and other witnesses, along with phone records and financial documents showing payments from Casso to the detectives. Both were convicted. Louis Ippolito died in prison in 2019. Stephen Caracappa is still serving his sentence. Casso, meanwhile, had his cooperation agreement revoked. The government claimed he'd lied during his debriefings and continued trying to run criminal operations from prison. He was sent back to maximum security. Casso died on December 15, 2020. He was 78 years old. He died at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, from complications with a global pandemic at the time. He'd cooperated. He'd given up his corrupt cops. He'd admitted to 36 murders. And he still died in prison, isolated and forgotten. Which brings us to the second story, because if having cops on your payroll couldn't save Anthony Casso, nothing would save the next guy when his own family decided he'd become a liability. Story 2. Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno ruled the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years without killing a single rival boss. That's not a small accomplishment. Most mob bosses lasted 5 years, maybe 10, before someone shot them or sent them to prison. Bruno lasted 2 decades by following one simple rule: don't make noise. Bruno became boss in 1959. He inherited a family that was relatively small, relatively poor, and relatively ignored by law enforcement. He decided to keep it that way. While a lot of families were fighting wars and attracting federal attention, Bruno focused on making money quietly. He ran numbers games, loan sharking operations, and labor racketeering. He avoided drugs. He avoided violence when possible. He maintained good relationships with New York's 5 families. They called him the Gentle Don. By the late 1970s, Bruno's family was stable and profitable. But younger members were getting frustrated. They saw the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Luccheses, all making millions from drug trafficking. They wanted in. Bruno refused. He believed drugs brought too much attention, too many arrests, too many informants. He banned his family from dealing. But his underboss, Phil Testa, disagreed. So did his consigliere, Antonio Caponegro. They believed Bruno was leaving money on the table. They believed the family should be bigger, more powerful, more aggressive. In March of 1980, Caponegro made a decision. He contacted the Commission, the ruling body of New York's 5 families, and asked for permission to kill Angelo Bruno. The Commission said no. Bruno was respected. He kept the peace for 20 years. There was no reason to kill him. Caponegro killed him anyway. On March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno was sitting in a car outside his home in South Philadelphia. He just finished dinner with his driver, John Stanfa. A man approached the car and shot Bruno once in the back of the head. Bruno died instantly. He was 69 years old. Antonio Caponegro believed he would become the new boss. He believed the commission would accept what he'd done once Bruno was gone. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, on April 18, 1980, Caponegro's body was found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. He'd been tortured. His body showed signs of severe beating. Dollar bills had been stuffed in his mouth and anus, a message that his greed had gotten him killed. The commission had sanctioned the hit on Caponegro. He'd killed the boss without permission. That was unforgivable. Phil Testa became boss of the Philadelphia family after Bruno's death, but his reign lasted less than a year. On March 15, 1981, a nail bomb exploded under Testa's front porch as he returned home. The blast killed him instantly. The Philadelphia family descended into chaos. Over the next decade, multiple bosses were killed or imprisoned. The family never recovered the stability it had under Bruno. Angelo Bruno had kept the peace for 21 years. The moment he died, everything fell apart. Speaking of things falling apart, the next story is about the man we started with, Sonny Black, who paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. Story 2. Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno ruled the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years without killing a single rival boss. That's not a small accomplishment. Most mob bosses lasted 5 years, maybe 10, before someone shot them or sent them to prison. Bruno lasted 2 decades by following one simple rule: don't make noise. Bruno became boss in 1959. He inherited a family that was relatively small, relatively poor, and relatively ignored by law enforcement. He decided to keep it that way. While a lot of families were fighting wars and attracting federal attention, Bruno focused on making money quietly. He ran numbers games, loan sharking operations, and labor racketeering. He avoided drugs. He avoided violence when possible. He maintained good relationships with New York's 5 families. They called him the Gentle Don. By the late 1970s, Bruno's family was stable and profitable. But younger members were getting frustrated. They saw the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Lucchese's, all making millions from drug trafficking. They wanted in. Bruno refused. He believed drugs brought too much attention, too many arrests, too many informants. He banned his family from dealing. But his underboss, Phil Testa, disagreed. So did his consigliere, Antonio Caponegro. They believed Bruno was leaving money on the table. They believed the family should be bigger, more powerful, more aggressive. In March of 1980, Caponegro made a decision. He contacted the commission, the ruling body of New York's 5 families, and asked for permission to kill Angelo Bruno. The commission said no. Bruno was respected. He kept the peace for 20 years. There was no reason to kill him. Caponegro killed him anyway. On March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno was sitting in a car outside his home in South Philadelphia. He just finished dinner with his driver, John Stanford. A man approached the car and shot Bruno once in the back of the head. Bruno died instantly. He was 69 years old. Antonio Caponegro believed he would become the new boss. He believed the commission would accept what he'd done once Bruno was gone. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, on April 18, 1980, Caponegro's body was found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. He'd been tortured. His body showed signs of severe beating. Dollar bills had been stuffed in his mouth and anus, a message that his greed had gotten him killed. The commission had sanctioned the hit on Caponegro. He'd killed the boss without permission. That was unforgivable. Phil Testa became boss of the Philadelphia family after Bruno's death, but his reign lasted less than a year. On March 15, 1981, a nail bomb exploded under Testa's front porch as he returned home. The blast killed him instantly. The Philadelphia family descended into chaos. Over the next decade, multiple bosses were killed or imprisoned. The family never recovered the stability it had under Bruno. Angelo Bruno had kept the peace for 21 years. The moment he died, everything fell apart. Speaking of things falling apart, the next story is about the man we started with, Sonny Black, who paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. Story 4. Michael Franzese. Michael Franzese was born into the Colombo crime family. His father, John Sonny Franzese, was a feared captain who'd been involved in dozens of murders. Michael grew up around mobsters. He knew the life. And in 1975, at age 24, he became a made man. By the early 1980s, Franzese was running one of the most profitable schemes in mob history, the gasoline pack scam. Here's how it worked. The federal government collected an 18-cent tax on every gallon of gasoline sold in the United States. Distributors were supposed to collect the tax and send it to the IRS. But Franzese created a network of shell companies that bought gasoline, sold it to gas stations, and never paid the tax. The money, hundreds of millions of dollars, went straight to Franzese and the Colombo family. Between 1980 and 1985, Franzese's operation generated an estimated $300 million to $1 billion. He was making $8 to $10 million per week. He became one of the richest mobsters in America. Fortune magazine listed him as number 18 on their list of the 50 most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses in 1986. But the IRS was investigating, and in 1985, they arrested Franzese on racketeering and tax evasion charges. At trial, the prosecution presented evidence at a gasoline scheme along with testimony from cooperating witnesses. Franzese was convicted in 1986. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. While serving his sentence, Franzese made a decision that shocked everyone in the mob. He quit. He didn't cooperate with authorities. He didn't testify against anyone. He just walked away. When he was released in 1994, he announced he was leaving organized crime. The mob didn't like that. You don't just quit. Once you're made, you're in for life. Leaving means you're either cooperating with the FBI or you're planning to write a book and make money off the family's secrets. Franzese did write a book, several actually. He became a motivational speaker. He gave interviews about his time in the mob. He started a YouTube channel. And somehow, he's still alive. Michael Franzese is now 73 years old. He lives in California. He claims he left the mob because he found religion and wanted to live a legitimate life. The mob has reportedly put out multiple contracts on him over the years, but none have been carried out. He's one of the few people who walked away from the mafia and survived. Which brings us to the fifth story about a boss who tried to walk away, but in a very different way.
Story 5. Vincent Basciano. Vincent Basciano became acting boss of the Bonanno crime family in 2004. He took over at a bad time. The family was in chaos. The previous boss, Joseph Massino, had just been arrested and would later become the first sitting New York boss to cooperate with the government. The FBI was everywhere. Indictments were dropping constantly. Basciano tried to hold the family together, but he made a critical mistake. He trusted the wrong person. In 2004, the FBI approached an associate named Dominic Sicali. They offered him a deal. Wear a wire, record conversations with Basciano, and we'll reduce your sentence on an unrelated charge. Sicali agreed. For months, Sicali recorded conversations with Basciano. He recorded discussions about murders. He recorded Basciano ordering hits. He recorded strategy meetings about how to handle the Massino situation. But the most damaging recording came in October of 2005. Basciano was in prison, awaiting trial on racketeering charges. Sicali visited him. They spoke in the prison visiting room, a room that's supposed to be monitored by guards, but often isn't. During that conversation, Basciano told Sicali he wanted to kill a prosecutor. Not just any prosecutor, the lead federal prosecutor handling mob cases in New York. Basciano wanted him dead. He told Sicali to pass the message to the family's acting leadership. Sicali recorded everything. That recording changed Basciano's case. Threatening to kill a federal prosecutor is a death penalty offense. The government immediately added a murder conspiracy charge to Basciano's indictment. At trial in 2011, the prosecution played the recording for the jury. They showed that Basciano had explicitly ordered the murder of a sitting federal prosecutor. The jury convicted him, but they didn't give him the death penalty. They gave him life in prison without parole. One juror later said they couldn't agree on execution, so they settled on life. Vincent Basciano is currently serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison. He's in solitary confinement, isolated from other inmates, allowed out of his cell for 1 hour per day. He's 63 years old. He'll die there. His mistake was simple. He talked about killing a prosecutor in a prison visiting room to a guy who was recording everything. The final story is about a man who made an even simpler mistake. He forgot that in the mafia, being too successful is just as dangerous as failing.
Story 6. Paul Vario. Paul Vario was a captain in the Lucchese crime family for over 30 years. He ran operations in Brooklyn, controlling the cargo area around JFK Airport. He oversaw hijacking operations, loan sharking, gambling, and extortion. He was quiet, careful, and extremely profitable. Henry Hill worked for Vario. So did Jimmy Burke. So did dozens of other associates who made Vario millions over the years. In 1978, Jimmy Burke and his crew pulled off the Lufthansa heist, the $6 million robbery at JFK Airport. Vario didn't plan the heist, but Burke was his associate, which meant Vario got a cut. The problem was the attention. The FBI launched a massive investigation into the Lufthansa heist. They were watching Burke, they were watching everyone connected to Burke, and that meant they were watching Vario. For years, Vario had avoided prosecution by staying quiet. But now, with the FBI investigating his crew, staying quiet wasn't enough. In 1984, the FBI arrested Paul Vario. They charged him with extortion, specifically extorting payoffs from air freight companies at JFK Airport. The evidence was solid. They had wiretaps, they had testimony from trucking company owners who'd been paying Vario for years. They had financial records. At trial, Vario was convicted. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. But while he was serving that sentence, the FBI built another case. Henry Hill, Vario's longtime associate, had entered witness protection in 1980. He'd been cooperating with the FBI, providing information about Vario's operations. And in 1988, Hill testified against Vario in a second trial, this time for a murder that had happened in 1969. The victim was Billy Bats Bentvena, a made man in the Gambino family. Tommy DeSimone had killed him in a dispute at a bar. Vario had helped dispose of the body. The jury convicted Vario of conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to an additional 10 years. Paul Vario died on May 3, 1988, while serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Worth, Texas. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure. He'd spent 30 years as a captain in the Lucchese family. He'd made millions. He'd avoided prison for most of his life. But in the end, one informant, Henry Hill, destroyed everything. Vario never got to enjoy his money. He never got out of prison, and he died knowing that the kid he'd mentored, the kid he'd trusted, had testified against him. November 4th, 1995, Manhattan Federal Court. A jury foreman stands up. The judge asks for the verdict. The foreman reads from a piece of paper, "Guilty on all counts." The defendant doesn't react. He's 70 years old. He's been a boss for nearly 3 decades. He built one of the most powerful crime families in America. And now he's going to die in prison. His name is Vincent Gigante. For 30 years, he wandered the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, pretending to be insane. For 30 years, prosecutors couldn't touch him. Psychiatrists testified he was mentally incompetent. Judges delayed his trials. But the act is over. The jury didn't believe it, and neither did the judge. That's story number 5. But first, let's talk about 4 other times the mob learned that even the smartest plan eventually falls apart.
Story 1. Agnello Della Croce. Agnello Della Croce was supposed to be boss of the Gambino crime family. He'd earned it. By the 1970s, Della Croce had been with the family for over 30 years. He was underboss under Carlo Gambino. He ran operations in Manhattan. He commanded respect from soldiers and captains across all 5 families. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, everyone expected Della Croce to take over, but Gambino's will said otherwise. Gambino named Paul Castellano as his successor. Castellano was Gambino's brother-in-law, family by marriage, not by the streets. He ran legitimate businesses. He wore suits. He didn't have the respect of the soldiers. Della Croce was furious, but he stayed loyal. He could have started a war. He could have challenged Castellano's leadership. Instead, he accepted the decision and remained underboss. For 9 years, Della Croce kept the peace between Castellano's businessmen and the family's street crows. He was the buffer, the mediator, the one person both sides respected. But by 1985, Della Croce was dying. He had lung cancer. He was in and out of the hospital. He could barely walk. And while he was sick, the tension between Castellano and the street crews was getting worse. Paul Castellano had banned drug dealing. He threatened to kill anyone caught selling. But John Gotti's crew, part of Della Croce's faction, was making millions from heroin. When Castellano found out, he wanted him dead. Della Croce tried to negotiate. He tried to protect Gotti, but he was too sick to control the situation. On December 2, 1985, Agnello Della Croce died at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He was 71 years old. 2 weeks later, on December 16th, John Gotti had Paul Castellano murdered outside Spock's Steakhouse. Della Croce's death removed the only person who could have prevented that war. With him gone, there was nothing stopping Gotti, no one to negotiate, no one to keep the peace. Castellano had disrespected Della Croce for years, made him underboss, but never gave him real power. And in the end, Della Croce's death was what allowed Gotti to kill Castellano without consequence. The man who should have been boss died in a hospital bed watching his family tear itself apart. Which brings us to the second story, because if Della Croce died before his time ran out, the next guy lived just long enough to see everything he built get destroyed.
Story 2. Anthony Corallo. Anthony Corallo became boss of the Lucchese crime family in 1970. He was smart, he was careful, he avoided attention. While other bosses were getting arrested, Corallo ran his family quietly, making money through labor racketeering, construction, and garbage collection. By the early 1980s, Corallo controlled a significant portion of New York's construction industry. If you wanted to build in Manhattan, you paid the Lucchese's. If you wanted your garbage picked up, you paid the Lucchese's. If you needed a union contract, you paid the Lucchese's. The family was making millions, but the FBI was watching. In 1983, they launched a massive investigation into the Commission, the ruling body that governed New York's 5 crime families. They planted bugs in social clubs, they wiretapped phones, they followed bosses to meetings, and they bugged Anthony Corallo's car. Corallo spent most of his time in a Jaguar sedan driven by his bodyguard, Salvatore Avellino. He held meetings in the car. He discussed family business while driving around Brooklyn and Queens. He thought it was safe. No one could plant a bug in a moving car. He was wrong. The FBI had installed a listening device in the Jaguar's dashboard. For months, they recorded every conversation Corallo had in that car. They recorded him discussing murders. They recorded him planning construction schemes. They recorded him giving orders to captains. In February of 1985, the FBI arrested Anthony Corallo along with the bosses of the other 4 families. The charges were racketeering, extortion, labor racketeering, and conspiracy. It was called the Commission Trial, the first time prosecutors had tried to charge the entire leadership of New York's Mafia at once. At trial, the prosecution presented hundreds of hours of recordings from Corallo's car. They showed that Corallo had personally ordered murders, approved construction rackets, and directed the family's criminal operations. The defense argued that the recordings were unclear, that Corallo was just talking, that the government was reading too much into casual conversations. The jury didn't buy it. On November 19, 1986, Anthony Corallo was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. Corallo appealed. He fought the conviction for years, but in January of 1992, the appeals court upheld the sentence. Anthony Corallo died on August 23, 2000, at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He was 87 years old. He'd been in prison for 15 years. The man who'd avoided arrest for decades, who'd run the Lucchese family with precision and discipline, was brought down by a bug in his own car. Speaking of bugs, the next story is about a social club that had so many listening devices, the FBI probably heard more conversations than the mobsters did.
Story 3. The Ravenite Social Club. The Ravenite Social Club sat at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. It was a small storefront, narrow, unremarkable, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing. But for nearly 30 years, it was the headquarters at a Gambino crime family. Carlo Gambino held meetings there in the 1960s and 70s. Paul Castellano used it occasionally, and when John Gotti became boss in 1985, he made the Ravenite his base of operations. Gotti held court there. Every week, captains and soldiers would line up outside, waiting to meet with him. He'd sit in the back room, hearing complaints, settling disputes, giving orders. It was where he ran the family. And the FBI was listening to everything. By 1989, the FBI had planted multiple listening devices inside the Ravenite. They had bugs in the walls, they had bugs in the ceiling, they had video cameras across the street recording everyone who entered and left. But there was a problem. Gotti knew the club was bugged, so he never discussed serious business in the main room. Instead, he'd take people upstairs to an apartment above the club, a small, cramped space that he believed was clean. It wasn't. In November of 1989, the FBI obtained a warrant to bug the upstairs apartment. They broke in during the night while the club was closed. They installed listening devices in the apartment's ceiling and walls. For over a year, the FBI recorded conversations in that apartment. They recorded Gotti discussing the murder of Paul Castellano. They recorded him planning murders of rival mobsters. They recorded him complaining about his underboss, Sammy Gravano. Those recordings would become the key evidence in Gotti's trial. But the FBI had another source too, Sammy Gravano himself. In November of 1990, the FBI arrested John Gotti at the Ravenite. They charged him with murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. During the trial preparation, Gotti's lawyers got access to the FBI's recordings. Gravano heard himself on the tapes. He heard Gotti criticizing him. He heard Gotti suggesting that Gravano might become a liability. He realized that if Gotti went down, Gotti would blame everything on him. So Gravano flipped. He agreed to testify against Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial began in January of 1992. The prosecution played the Ravenite recordings for the jury. Then they put Sammy Gravano on the stand. He testified for 9 days, describing murders, rackets, and Gotti's role in running the Gambino family. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Ravenite Social Club closed shortly after. The building sat empty for years. Today, it's a shoe store. But for a brief period in the late 1980s, that small storefront on Mulberry Street was the most surveilled location in New York. The FBI heard everything, and they used those recordings to dismantle the Gambino family. The next story is about a man who thought he could avoid surveillance by never using phones, never meeting in clubs, and never leaving a paper trail. He was wrong. Story 4. Phil Leonetti. Philip Leonetti was the nephew of Nicky Scarfo, boss of the Philadelphia crime family. Scarfo became boss in 1981 after the previous boss, Phil Testa, was killed in a nail bomb explosion. Scarfo was violent, paranoid, and ruthless. He killed people for minor offenses. He demanded absolute loyalty, and he made his nephew, Phil Leonetti, his underboss. Leonetti was 28 years old when he became underboss. He'd grown up in the mob. His uncle had trained him since childhood. He knew how to kill, he knew how to run operations, and he was loyal to Scarfo. Between 1981 and 1987, Leonetti participated in at least 10 murders. He shot people, he helped dispose of bodies, he carried out Scarfo's orders without question. But by 1987, Leonetti was starting to see the problems. Scarfo was killing too many people. He'd murdered over 30 members and associates of the Philadelphia family since becoming boss. He was paranoid about betrayal. He suspected everyone. The family was falling apart. In January of 1987, the FBI arrested Nicky Scarfo and Phil Leonetti on racketeering charges. The evidence included testimony from multiple informants, wiretap recordings, and surveillance footage. At trial in January of 1992, both were convicted. Scarfo was sentenced to 55 years. Leonetti was sentenced to 45 years. Leonetti was 35 years old. He was looking at spending the rest of his life in prison. That's when he made a decision.
In 1989, while serving his sentence, Phil Leonetti agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He admitted to participating in 10 murders. He provided detailed testimony about the Philadelphia family's operations, about Scarfo's leadership, about corrupt politicians and judges who'd been on the mob's payroll. His cooperation destroyed what was left of the Philadelphia family. His testimony led to dozens of convictions. Nicky Scarfo's organization collapsed. But Leonetti's decision had consequences. He was betraying his uncle. He was breaking omertà. And in the mob, that's a death sentence. In exchange for his cooperation, Leonetti's sentence was reduced to 6.5 years. He was released in 1994 and entered the Witness Protection Program. Today, Phil Leonetti lives under an assumed name in an undisclosed location. He's written a book about his time in the mob. He's given interviews, but he's never returned to Philadelphia. The contracts on his life are still active. Nicky Scarfo died in prison on January 13, 2017. He was 87 years old. He spent the last 30 years of his life in federal custody, watching his nephew testify against him and his family disintegrate. Phil Leonetti survived, but he'll never be able to go home. Which brings us to the 5th story, the one we started with. Because if Phil Leonetti's cooperation destroyed his family, the next guy's fake insanity couldn't save his. Story 5. Vincent Gigante's trial. Vincent Gigante had been pretending to be insane since the 1960s. He wandered around Greenwich Village in pajamas and a bathrobe. He mumbled to himself. He urinated in public. When investigators tried to question him, he acted confused and incoherent. For decades, it worked. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia and dementia. Courts declared him mentally incompetent to stand trial. Prosecutors couldn't touch him. But by the early 1990s, the FBI had enough evidence to try anyway. They had wiretap recordings of Gigante speaking clearly and coherently when he thought no one was listening. They had surveillance footage of him walking normally when he wasn't in public. They had testimony from former associates who said the mental illness was fake. In 1990, the FBI indicted Gigante on racketeering charges. His lawyers immediately filed motions claiming he was too mentally ill to stand trial. The judge ordered psychiatric evaluations. For 5 years, the case was delayed. Multiple doctors examined Gigante. Some said he was genuinely ill. Others said he was faking. The judge couldn't make a decision. Finally, in 1995, prosecutors brought in their own expert, a psychiatrist who reviewed all the evidence, including surveillance footage of Gigante behaving normally in private. The psychiatrist testified that Gigante was malingering, faking mental illness to avoid prosecution. On June 25, 1995, the judge ruled that Vincent Gigante was competent to stand trial.
The trial began in September. The prosecution presented wiretap recordings of Gigante discussing family business, ordering murders, and running the Genovese crime family. They showed surveillance footage of him meeting with other mobsters. They brought in witnesses who testified about Gigante's leadership. The defense argued that Gigante was mentally ill, that he couldn't have been running a criminal organization, that the recordings were misinterpreted. On November 4, 1995, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Vincent Gigante was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. But even in prison, he continued the act. He shuffled around in slippers, he mumbled incoherently, he refused to acknowledge guards or other inmates. Then, in 2003, something changed. Gigante was facing additional charges related to a murder conspiracy. His lawyers filed a motion to reduce his sentence, and in that motion, Gigante admitted, for the first time in 40 years, that his mental illness had been fake. The admission came too late to affect his case. He remained in prison. Vincent Gigante died on December 19, 2005, at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He was 77 years old. He'd spent 40 years pretending to be insane, and in the end, it delayed his prosecution by 5 years. That's it, 5 years, and he still died in prison. The final story is about a man who didn't fake insanity or pretend to be incompetent. He just refused to talk for 30 years. Story 6. Maddie the Horse. Matthew Ianiello was called Maddie the Horse. No one remembers exactly why. Some people said it was because he was strong. Others said it was because he was stubborn. Either way, the nickname stuck. Maddie the Horse was a captain in the Genovese crime family. He controlled Manhattan's West Side, specifically the gay bars, strip clubs, and adult entertainment venues around Times Square in Greenwich Village. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Maddie ran protection rackets, loan sharking operations, and extortion schemes. He owned legitimate businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, bars, and used them to launder money. He was arrested multiple times, convicted multiple times, sent to prison multiple times, and he never cooperated, never testified, never gave up a single name. In 1986, the FBI arrested Maddie as part of a massive racketeering case against the Genovese family. The charges included extortion, labor racketeering, and conspiracy. At trial, the prosecution presented wiretap recordings, financial documents, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Maddie the Horse was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was released in 2004. He was 81 years old. Most mobsters, when they get out of prison in their 80s, retire. They stay home, they avoid attention. Not Maddie the Horse. Within months of his release, the FBI started investigating him again. They had surveillance footage of him meeting with Genovese family members. They had wiretaps of him discussing business. They had evidence that he was still running operations. In 2009, at age 86, Maddie the Horse was arrested again,
The charges were racketeering and extortion, the same charges he'd been convicted of 20 years earlier.
At trial, the prosecution showed that Matty had been involved in a scheme to control New York's San Gennaro Festival, an annual Italian street fair in Little Italy. He'd been extorting vendors, taking kickbacks, and using the festival to generate income for the Genovese family. Matty was convicted, again. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He was released in 2012. He was 89 years old. Matthew Iannello died on August 28, 2012, less than a month after his release. He was 89 years old. The cause of death was natural causes. He died at home in New Jersey. He'd been arrested more times than most people can count. He'd been convicted of racketeering twice. He'd spent over 20 years in federal prison, and he never cooperated, never testified, never broke omertà. Matty the Horse was one of the last of his kind, a mobster who went to prison, did his time, got out, and went right back to work. No deals, no testimony, no witness protection. He died free, and he died without ever giving up a name. September 10th, 1996. Brooklyn Federal Court. A judge reads the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The defendant stands there, silent. He's 61 years old. He's been in the mob since he was a teenager. He killed his first man when he was 25. And now, after 40 years in organized crime, it's over. His name is Gregory Scarpa. They called him the Grim Reaper. But here's the thing nobody knew until recently. For 30 years, while he was murdering people for the Colombo family, he was also working as an FBI informant. He fed information to his FBI handler. He helped solve cases. And at the same time, he was killing witnesses, whacking rivals, and running one of the most violent crews in New York. That's story number 4. But first, let's talk about 3 other times the line between law enforcement and organized crime got very, very blurry. Story 1. Whitey Bulger. James Whitey Bulger ran the Winter Hill Gang in Boston from the 1970s through the mid-1990s. He controlled drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking across South Boston. He killed at least 19 people, probably more. He was one of the most feared criminals in Boston history, and for 16 years, he was protected by the FBI. In 1975, an FBI agent named John Connolly approached Bulger with an offer. Connolly had grown up in South Boston. He knew Bulger from the neighborhood, and he wanted to use him to take down the Italian mafia in Boston, specifically the Patriarca crime family. Bulger agreed to become an informant. In exchange, Connolly would protect them from prosecution. For the next 16 years, Bulger fed information to Connolly about the Patriarca family. He told him about meetings, murders, and business operations. The FBI used that information to indict and convict multiple members of the Patriarca organization. But while Bulger was informant on the Italians, he was also murdering people in South Boston. In 1981, Bulger killed Roger Wheeler, a businessman who owned World Gyali. Wheeler was refusing to cooperate with Bulger's extortion schemes, so Bulger had him shot in the parking lot of his country club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1982, Bulger killed Brian Halloran, a member of his own organization who was cooperating with the FBI. Bulger found out through John Connolly, his FBI handler, that Halloran was talking. So he shot Halloran on a Boston street in broad daylight. The FBI knew Bulger was killing people, but Connolly buried the evidence. He destroyed reports. He warned Bulger about investigations. He protected him from other law enforcement agencies. But the early 1990s, the FBI realized they had a problem. Bulger wasn't just informant on the mob, he had become the mob. He controlled more territory than the Patriarca family. He was more violent. He was untouchable. In 1994, the FBI indicted Bulger on racketeering charges, but before they could arrest him, John Connolly warned them. Bulger disappeared. He stayed on the run for 16 years. In June of 2011, the FBI finally caught him. He was living in Santa Monica, California with his girlfriend. They arrested him without incident. At trial in 2013, the prosecution presented evidence of 19 murders. Witnesses testified about Bulger's control of South Boston, his extortion schemes, his drug trafficking operations. The defense argued that Bulger had been an FBI informant, that the government had authorized his actions. The jury didn't care. They convicted him on multiple counts of racketeering and murder. Bulger was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. On October 30, 2018, James Bulger was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Hazleton, West Virginia. Within 12 hours of arriving, he was beaten to death by other inmates. He was 89 years old. John Connolly, the FBI agent who protected Bulger, was convicted of racketeering in 2002 and second-degree murder in 2008. He's currently serving 40 years in a Florida state prison. Whitey Bulger murdered 19 people while working as an FBI informant, and the FBI protected him for 16 years because he was useful. Which brings us to the second story. Because if Whitey Bulger was protected by one corrupt agent, the next guy had an entire police department helping him. Story 2. Nicky Barnes. Leroy Nicky Barnes was the biggest heroin dealer in New York City in the 1970s. He wasn't Italian, he wasn't connected to any of the 5 families, he was an independent operator who ran his own organization, a predominantly black drug trafficking network that distributed heroin across Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Barnes called his organization the Council. It consisted of 7 men who each controlled different territories. They pooled their resources, shared suppliers, and divided profits. It was efficient, organized, and extremely profitable. By 1976, Barnes was making over $1 million per day. The NYPD knew who he was. They'd arrested him multiple times, but they could never make charges stick. Witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, juries refused to convict. In 1977, the New York Times Magazine put Barnes on the cover with the headline, "Mr. Untouchable." The article detailed his lavish lifestyle, his control of Harlem's drug trade, and his ability to avoid prosecution. President Jimmy Carter saw the article. He was furious. He ordered a federal task force to investigate Barnes and dismantle the council. The DEA and FBI launched a massive operation. They wiretapped phones, they followed Barnes everywhere, they tracked his money, and in March of 1977, they arrested him on federal drug trafficking charges. At trial in 1978, the prosecution presented testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses, former members of the council who'd been arrested and agreed to testify. They described Barnes's operation, his distribution network, and his role in importing heroin from Southeast Asia. The defense argued that Barnes was being targeted because of the magazine article, that the government was embarrassed and wanted a conviction regardless of the evidence. The jury convicted Barnes on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Barnes went to federal prison believing the council would continue operating in his absence. He believed the other members would support his family, send money, take care of his wife. They didn't. Within months, Barnes learned that his associates were keeping all the profits. They weren't supporting his family. Some of them were sleeping with his wife. In 1982, Nicky Barnes made a decision. He called federal prosecutors and told them he wanted to cooperate.
For the next several years, Bonds worked as a government witness. He testified against his former associates. He provided information about drug trafficking operations, corrupt police officers, and murder conspiracies. His testimony led to the convictions of over 50 people, including all 6 remaining members of the council. In exchange, Bonds entered the Witness Protection Program. His sentence was reduced, he was given a new identity, and relocated to an undisclosed location. Nicky Bonds died on June 1, 2012, at age 78. The New York Times didn't report his death until 2019, 7 years later, because his family wanted to protect his new identity. The man who'd been called Mr. Untouchable died in obscurity, under an assumed name, in a city nobody knows. His former empire was dismantled, his associates were in prison, and nobody in Harlem even knew he was gone. Speaking of people who became informants, the next story is about a Colombo family hitman who informed on the mob while simultaneously killing people for them.
Story 3. Gregory Scarpa. Gregory Scarpa joined the Colombo crime family in the 1950s. By the 1960s, he was a made man and one of the family's most reliable killers. He murdered rivals, he collected debts, he handled problems quietly and efficiently. In 1962, the FBI approached Scarpa with an offer. They wanted information about the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. The FBI believed local Ku Klux Klan members had murdered them and buried the bodies. They needed someone to extract information from a KKK member they'd arrested. Scarpa agreed to help. He flew to Mississippi, kidnapped the KKK member, beat him, and tortured him until he revealed where the bodies were buried. The FBI was impressed. They asked if Scarpa would be willing to provide information about the Colombo family on an ongoing basis. Scarpa said yes. For the next 30 years, Gregory Scarpa was both the Colombo family hitman and an FBI informant. His handler was an agent named Lindley DeVecchio. Scarpa would meet with DeVecchio regularly, providing information about mob activities, upcoming murders, and family politics. In exchange, DeVecchio protected Scarpa. He warned him about investigations, he helped him avoid arrests, and according to later testimony, he may have even provided Scarpa with information that led to murders. During the early 1990s, the Colombo family was fighting an internal war, the Third Colombo War, between the Arena faction and the Persico faction. Scarpa was a loyal Persico supporter, and during that war, he killed at least 3 members of the Arena faction. Some evidence suggests DeVecchio told Scarpa where to find his targets. In 1992, the FBI finally cut ties with Scarpa. The relationship had become too controversial. Too many people were asking questions about how Scarpa kept avoiding prosecution despite being involved in multiple murders. In 1993, federal prosecutors indicted Scarpa on racketeering and murder charges. The evidence was overwhelming: wiretaps, testimony from cooperating witnesses, forensic evidence linking him to crime scenes. But Scarpa was dying. He had AIDS, contracted through a blood transfusion years earlier. He was weak, sick, and barely able to appear in court. At trial in 1996, Scarpa's lawyers argued that he couldn't receive a fair trial because of his relationship with the FBI. They claimed DeVecchio had authorized Scarpa's criminal activities, that the government had essentially given him permission to commit murders. The jury convicted him anyway.
Gregory Scarpa was sentenced to life in prison, but he never served the sentence. He died on June 8, 1994, while awaiting transfer to federal prison. He was 66 years old. Lindley DeVecchio, his FBI handler, was charged in 2006 with 4 counts of murder. Prosecutors alleged he'd helped Scarpa commit murders by providing information.
But in 2007, the charges were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Gregory Scarpa killed at least 50 people during his 30 years in the Colombo family, and for most of that time, he was working for the FBI. The next story is about a man who didn't work for the FBI, but somehow managed to turn the entire Italian government into his personal protection agency. Story 4. Lucky Luciano's exile. Charles Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946. He'd been convicted of running a prostitution ring in New York in 1936. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, but during World War II, the Navy made a deal with him. The Navy needed help securing the New York waterfront against German sabotage. Luciano, even from prison, controlled the docks through his connections to the Genovese crime family. He agreed to help in exchange for a reduced sentence. After the war ended, Luciano's sentence was commuted, but instead of being released in New York, he was deported to Italy. He was Italian-born, so the government sent him back to his country of origin. Luciano arrived in Italy in February in 1946. He was supposed to stay there. The terms of his deportation forbade him from ever returning to the United States, but Luciano had no intention of retiring. Within months, he'd established contact with American mobsters. He set up operations in Rome, Naples, and Sicily. He began coordinating heroin trafficking between Sicily and the United States, what would later become known as the French Connection. Sicilian mafia families produced raw opium in the Middle East, refined it in laboratories in Sicily and France, then shipped it to American mob families for distribution. Luciano organized the entire operation from Italy. The Italian government knew what he was doing, but they didn't stop him. Some historians believe Luciano had connections to Italian intelligence agencies. Others believe he was simply too powerful to arrest. In October of 1946, Luciano traveled to Cuba. He claimed he was going for a vacation. In reality, he was attending a massive mafia summit, the Havana Conference, where bosses from all over the United States gathered to discuss business. The U.S. government found out. They pressured the Cuban government to deport Luciano back to Italy. In February of 1947, Luciano was forced to leave Cuba. He returned to Italy and continued running his operations from there. For the next 15 years, Luciano lived in Rome and Naples, coordinating drug trafficking, managing American mob families from overseas, and avoiding extradition. The FBI wanted him back in the United States to face additional charges, but Italy refused to extradite him. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano collapsed at Naples International Airport. He was meeting with a film producer to discuss a movie about his life. He had a massive heart attack. Luciano died at the airport. He was 64 years old. His body was eventually returned to the United States and buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens. The deportation that was supposed to end his criminal career had instead turned him into an international drug trafficking coordinator. Speaking of drug trafficking, the next story is about the Pizza Connection, one of the largest heroin operations in American history. Story 5. The Pizza Connection. In 1980, the FBI noticed something strange. Small pizza parlors across the northeastern United States were conducting enormous cash transactions. Places that should have been making a few $100s per day were depositing tens of thousands into bank accounts. The FBI started investigating. What they found was one of the largest drug trafficking operations in American history. Sicilian mafia families were smuggling heroin into the United States through pizza parlors. The parlors were fronts, legitimate businesses that served real pizza, but whose primary purpose was laundering drug money and serving as distribution points for heroin. The operation worked like this. Sicilian mafiosi would import heroin from Turkey and Southeast Asia. They'd refine it in laboratories in Sicily.
Then they'd smuggle it into the United States, hidden in shipments of food products, clothing, or other legitimate goods. Once in the U.S., the heroin would be stored in pizza parlors controlled by Sicilian mobsters. Dealers would pick up their supply from the parlors. The cash from drug sales would be deposited as pizza parlor revenue. The money would then be wired back to Sicily through international banks.
Between 1975 and 1984, the pizza connection moved an estimated $1.65 billion worth of heroin into the United States. The FBI investigation involved wiretaps on dozens of phones, surveillance of over 20 pizza parlors, and coordination with Italian law enforcement. In April of 1984, they made their move. The FBI arrested 22 people in the United States. Italian police arrested dozens more in Sicily. The arrests spanned multiple cities: New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Illinois. The main defendant was Gaetano Badalamenti, a Sicilian mafia boss who'd been exiled from Sicily and had been coordinating the American operation from Brazil and Spain. The trial began in October 1985. It lasted 17 months, one of the longest criminal trials in American history at that time. The prosecution presented testimony from over 200 witnesses, including cooperating Sicilian mafiosi, undercover agents, and financial experts. The defense argued that the pizza parlors were legitimate businesses, that any drug trafficking was done by individual employees without the knowledge of the owners. In March of 1987, the jury convicted 18 of the 22 defendants. Gaetano Badalamenti was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. He died in prison in 2004 at 80 years old. The pizza connection was dismantled, the parlors were shut down, the money laundering networks were destroyed. But the case proved something important. The Sicilian mafia and American mafia were still working together, decades after Lucky Luciano's deportation, and they were using legitimate businesses as fronts for operations worth billions. The final story is about a man who tried to use a legitimate business as a front and ended up destroying one of New York's most iconic industries. Story 6: The Mafia and the Fulton Fish Market. The Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan was the largest fish market in the United States. Every morning from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m., vendors would sell fresh fish to restaurants, grocery stores, and distributors across New York. Millions of pounds of fish moved through that market every week. And for 70 years, the Genovese crime family controlled it. The Genovese family didn't own the vendors. They didn't sell fish. They ran what's called a loading racket. Here's how it worked. If you wanted to buy fish at the Fulton market, you needed someone to unload it from the trucks and carry it to your vehicle. The only people allowed to do that work were members of a union controlled by the Genovese family. The loading fees were outrageous, sometimes 2 or 3 times the cost of the fish itself. But if you refused to pay, your fish would sit on the loading dock. No one would touch it. It would rot. Vendors had no choice. They paid. The Genovese family made millions from the Fulton Fish Market. For decades, it was one of their most reliable sources of income. But in 1988, Rudolph Giuliani, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, decided to investigate. The FBI planted undercover agents in the market. They documented the loading racket, recorded extortion payments, and identified the Genovese members running the operation. In 1991, the government filed a civil racketeering lawsuit against the Fulton Fish Market. They didn't just charge individual mobsters, they sued the entire market, arguing that it was controlled by organized crime. The court agreed. In 1992, the Fulton Fish Market was placed under government oversight. Federal monitors were installed to supervise operations. The loading racket was dismantled. Mob-controlled unions were replaced. But the damage was done. With the mob gone, the market lost its power. Vendors started buying fish from other locations. Distributors moved to New Jersey, where costs were lower. In 2005, the Fulton Fish Market closed its Manhattan location and moved to the Bronx. The historic market that had operated in Lower Manhattan for over 180 years was gone. The Genovese family's 70-year control of the market had made them millions. But once that control was broken, the market itself couldn't survive.